when AI is helpful, when it is in our homes, when it is the most, the clearest extension of who we are as human beings, our avatars, we want the technology to be as similar to us as possible. But in the context of warfare, where we must create a level of psychological distance, that is when we want to institute a completely different set of standards. And so even though we tend to think about it as existential risk, it actually has more to do with human psychology.
This is All Quiet on the Second Front, a podcast where boring conversations around defense tech and national security come to die. Join me, Tyler Sweatt, and my Second Front comrades as we dismantle the mundane and cut through the bureaucratic BS to demystify the world of defense tech. But be warned, this is not a typical government podcast. Ready to get weird? What's up, everybody? I'm your host, Tyler Sweatt. Welcome to another episode of All Quiet on the Second Front, podcast where boring defense talk comes to die. Bringing out the big guns today with Dr. Courtney Crosby.
Thank you.
Little Booz Allen Hamilton flair. I think more interesting than the Booz Allen side is a lot of the work you do on decision, sort of bringing soft science to hard problems.
Yep.
Super excited to dig into that. So thanks for swinging by.
Likewise, super grateful to be here,
Heck
especially
yeah.
given some of the voices you've had on recently. Yeah. Hopefully, it was funny. I was actually listening to some of the recent episodes, and I think you seeded maybe some of this conversation unbeknownst to you. So hopefully we can draw some good connections there. But yeah, so for folks who don't know me, Dr. Courtney Crosby, I oversee our AI special missions work at Booz Allen, which is essentially just a highly specialized team that does hard problems within special operations, sensitive activities, anything forward deployed. We also have a team within that does AI futures. So looking at Horizon 2, Horizon 3 problems. Yeah, for sure.
Couple places to go. I'm trying to figure out the best place to start. So let's start.
The hardest.
Yeah, let's start future and walk back.
Yeah.
Because I think that'll be an interesting way to frame this out. Because I think so much conversation around like AI and decision support all starts at today, which means it started, the last decision or the last decision.
Yeah. Especially with the requirements
100%.
And acquisition cycles
100%.
that we have.
There's a massive lag there. So as you guys look to the future, right? And not, with all the special missions and SAP stuff, I don't want to have to go back and redact all of this shit. So
we're not that special.
Yeah. So how are you guys thinking about, I guess, frame that out when you talk about like a Horizon 2, Horizon 3 for the listeners as they're thinking about, hey, what does that mean in terms of both contextualization, whether that's operational or temporal or just in a decision framework, and then from an AI standpoint, what do those kind of look like?
Okay, loaded question.
Softball questions up front.
Easy start. Yeah, no. So when we think futures, we're thinking 3 to 7 years out predominantly, and trying to imagine what those operational scenarios are so that we can backcast out the role that technology would likely play in that future fight. So that's the primary context behind what we do. And a lot of that I think is fascinating because we as human beings are terrible at imagining the future, describing the future. We're so bad at it, right? And so I think a lot of what we do is not try to predict what that future is going to be, but maximize maneuverability to get you in the vicinity of a future that is palatable.
Yeah.
And a lot of times that is not a hard, direct path. It is, how do we just take the next step with our left foot instead of our right? And over time, getting close to where we want to be.
Yeah. When you work with different sort of constituencies on that, how are you helping bring them along in there so that you can have maybe in like untethered conversation about what if or the art of the possible?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of the hard part of what you and I do, right? We operate in a world that is highly constrained. And sometimes there is this desire to want to come up with the blue sky ideas, and you want to be the genius that is thinking of the problem that nobody has thought about.
Everybody wants to be Andy Marshall, so they try to be Andy Marshall.
Man. Yeah, that's what gets the endorphins flowing.
Legend.
For sure. And so much of what we do realistically is coloring brilliantly inside the lines.
Yeah.
Like if you cannot meet that constraint satisfaction, at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So a lot of it is trying to couch it within those parameters, but also understanding that we as human beings, talking about some of my background in more of the soft sciences, it is difficult for us to describe abstract ideas and to buy into those ideas. And so a lot of what we do is really making it more consumable and more realistic. Yeah.
Yeah, it's from the consumability aspect leads really nicely to sort of the question I was going to ask around, hey, okay, so I sort of create sort of this art of the possible. It's not too rigid, so it allows for some permeability. It allows folks to maybe see themselves in it. Yeah. So I'm seeding adoption and acceptance. It's a little bit of a breadcrumb. When I get them in there and we're talking about, a 3 to 7 year horizon, take it all the way back to the beginning and juxtapose that with, subsets of a community that have been in a 24-hour just flywheel for 20 years.
Yep.
How do you toggle between the two? And I'd argue that is not a unique problem to the SOF or special missions or anything. It's the same problem. It's the tyranny of now, the tyranny of today. How have you, either through your work with the community or your background on a lot of this, there's an interesting sort of intersection there on like the practical and the academic. And
there's a balance. And there is a tension in those two arenas being implicitly at odds. And I think too, even extrapolating out to the broader innovation cycle, we have this notion in the department that progress is prototype to program of record. Yeah. Even though we are acutely aware that does not always work, and in fact a majority of the time does not work. We lament and have all of these conversations about the valley of death and why can't any of you cross it, instead of asking if that is even the trajectory that we should be on. Is that point A to point Z, right? And so I think that your question applies even more broadly to the way that we think about defense innovation and technology more broadly. It's funny because there's a quote that I love. One of my most favorite authors is actually an author out of Argentina where I lived for a while. He was writing back in the 1940s about like reality and simulation, things that today seed science fiction and technology literature, but back in the day using a constrained vocabulary and the terminology that was available. Obviously writing in Spanish, and he says, "A veces me pregunto si estamos todos soñando que estamos despiertos." And applying it to this conversation, it's like, are we so disillusioned that we actually believe that we are woke to the reality that's in front of us, the future that we see, right? And I think in the department, we can get extremely, almost fooled by ourselves into buying into this idea that we are actually read on to what's coming down the pipe.
Yeah. Where do you, as folks who are listening and they're in the department or maybe they're in the Hill or the private sector, like what are proxies or, as folks are thinking about, where's a good example? Where's somebody who does this good? What do I point at there?
Obviously in my community, I think that it is one of the places where we are extremely successful in innovating on new technology, deploying them very rapidly. I think that is at odds with a lot of what we see strategically and where the department is moving into more of a centralized innovation ecosystem, where a lot of the success and where we can actually draw lessons learned and metrics is from the communities that we work in around. A lot of times that federated innovation is actually where we are most successful. And I think that goes back to my comment about, the traditional trajectory and why it doesn't seemingly work. But when you have an entire apparatus, an entire organization, the entire department moving towards this idea of how do we centralize and scale innovation, right? I was just listening to, the episode that you released yesterday. I think it was Matt. It might have been
Matt Biggie.
I think it was Matt that said something about, we would be better off if we could get everybody on the X.
Yeah.
But that's the whole point. You can't.
Yeah.
And so there is a lack of relevancy, a lack of timeliness, a lack of operational understanding that does promulgate across the department that makes innovation insanely difficult to scale.
Yeah.
And like that's the problem, right?
It's interesting, right? Because I think that problem manifests, to go back to your comment about the valley of death and, hey, like, why can't you guys just traverse this fucking thing?
What is wrong with all of you?
Yeah, right? But I think there's a...
Do better.
I think it's your words from a previous conversation, but there's like a first mile and a last mile problem. And they're not the same problem. And like
but the last mile ones are so sexy, right? So when we think about it, you know, so much of what we have focused on is the machine engineering, the actual technicality of it all. Yeah. And the majority of the challenges that we face today in the department are not strictly technical.
Correct.
But that is what we've necessarily focused on to catch up, right? Yeah. And so obviously the benefit of that is that we have reached a point in time where the baseline technology largely exists. And so we now believe that we are solving all of these last mile problems. It is the finesse of transitioning a mature technology, a dual use technology into the department. It is the fine tuning and the hyperparameterization and Gen AI. It's, you know, how do we think about grounding techniques? And that is, especially with type A personalities and the majority of people that are trying to solve some of these hard problems, gosh, that's appealing. Yeah. But the reality of it is that you can't solve any of those last mile problems without getting through the first mile. Yeah. And at the end of the day, I think you and I have both seen time and time again, those are the problems of how do we get on the network? How do we badge into a facility when we aren't on contract because we're not a big prime? Like, who is the person who understands what codec to use and who's plugging in the Ethernet cable? And, you know, which analyst knows how to turn on a volumetric filter so that the algorithm actually sees an image instead of an entire frame, right? And I think a lot of people listening would say, those aren't real problems. But yet we even see in acquisition the same RFPs coming down. There was one that recently came down out of Sky Moore's shop, who you should totally have on, by the way.
She's so freaking
God,
smart.
She's amazing.
Yeah, she rocks.
Out of her shop, which is essentially the exact same technology, the exact same AOR that we were solving for in 2017. Brand new RFP that says, great, thank you, but now can you do it with the user in mind? Yeah. And so I think that's where a lot of my background comes from, right? Where it's still wild to me that this is my job. Like, I'm just dude, I'm a dork who came from social science, you know? It's crazy. But I think so much of that in having that background in decision science and cognitive engineering is understanding that that is actually the piece that we are often missing. Yeah. And I think that we've really atrophied in our ability to even define hard problems and understand them, right?
Yeah, I was going to ask, you know, it was maybe a different config than I was thinking when you talked about first mile and last mile.
Oh, what were you thinking?
Which was super interesting to me because then when you got through it, I was like, oh, no, wait, we're just using different lexicon.
Yeah, what's yours?
Right? Like what you described as last mile, to me, that's that stuff everybody does in the front because it's easy and you can touch it and you can put it on a slide.
Yeah.
And they do
vignette
that
or it didn't happen.
Yeah, they do that as the first mile and everyone's all excited and there's like an AOI and whatever.
Yeah.
The last mile is like, all right, cool. How do I make it go burr? Because I was at like, how do we generate effects from this?
Yeah. Oh my God.
And it's how do I get it into production? How do I get it into someone's hands? How do I get it over a wall or behind a door?
Yep.
All of that. And those are like the not sexy admin things. And it's like, cool, like you could throw $100 billion at problem X. But absent like these four non-sexy things, effects will not be generated.
Yeah. And I mean, even thinking about effects, you know, a lot of the strategic offsets that every strategic offset that we've seen is essentially tied to our ability to create effects, right? The basic premise of warfare. And I think a lot of the solutions, talking about the beauty of what we do, most of the best solutions and the architects behind those solutions are people who are acutely aware that warfare at its core is still a human endeavor. Oh, yeah. You know, you and I were just at the range the other day. Yep. Obviously, you've spent a lot of time on the range. I think one of the most compelling kind of thought exercises around this idea of effects and how technology plays a role and like the standards that we apply to it and how we as human beings think about those concepts is something as simple as marksmanship, right?
Yeah.
So in the spirit of your podcast, we'll go way into the deep end here, like going hard in the paint, right?
Let's do it.
Autonomous weapons.
Yep.
What would you say the average person listening to the podcast believes that the accuracy of an autonomous weapon should be for it to be palatable as somebody sitting in the American populace?
I think it's the Supreme Court's definition of pornography.
Okay.
Yeah, they know when they see it.
Fair.
Yeah.
High threshold.
Yeah.
You know or you don't. And I think with autonomous weapons, the most common answer that I hear is like really fucking accurate.
Yeah.
100% accurate, which is fascinating to me because I think that there is a extreme disconnect between the thresholds and the standards that we apply to AI and the thresholds and standards that we apply to human beings. You've been on a range. You've seen a range
Nerd
card.
conversation around precision and accuracy,
Insane,
too.
dude.
Like, oh.
You have 40 bullets,
Yep.
and how many of them need to hit a target as a human being?
Yep.
Just 23 of them. Yep. And we're okay with that.
Yep.
And so I think, obviously relying heavily on my background, a lot of the way that we approach that thought process within cognitive engineering is like, why do we apply such different thresholds to technology?
Yeah.
And in that context...
Take it one step back from autonomous weapons. This is Alexis Bennell talks about this all the time.
Yes.
Hey,
yes.
We, to your point on, 23 to 40, here's my soldier, sailor,
Dude, that's
airman,
so
marine.
bad. That's like barely 50%.
But also, we're then saying, cool, that meets a threshold for me to give you, kinetic capability.
Yep.
But I don't trust you to use some low level, like air quote AI tool.
Yeah.
And it's like, wait a second. Like, are they capable or are they not? Or is it we trust by sort of checklist kind of thing? And there's this massive sort of like juxtaposition of like, yeah, hey, you're empowered, like the strategic corporal, to use what was that? TX wrote that back in the day.
Yeah, man.
The 3-block war.
Yeah.
I don't know if we do a really good job reconciling that, even on the non-sexy stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think part of that stems from, we tend to couch it or justify it within the context of, but this is like an existential threat.
Yeah.
And I think so much of the way that we view it from a social science background is not that it's actually an existential threat. It's that we as human beings, when AI is most similar to us and comports with our view of the positive attributes of a human being, right? When AI is helpful, when it is in our homes, when it is the most the clearest extension of who we are as human beings, our avatars, we want the technology to be as similar to us as possible. But in the context of warfare, where we must create a level of psychological distance, that is when we want to institute a completely different set of standards. And so even though we tend to think about it as existential risk, it actually has more to do with human psychology.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, part of that boils into trust, where you see some of like the wingman program struggling.
Yeah.
I think part of that boils into, to steal a line from Tommy Hendricks, right? Like the fetish of combat.
Yeah.
And people have this belief that it's clean and surgical and it's
Absolutely.
precise.
But actually, it's just 23.
It's just chaos. Yeah.
23
out of 40.
23 hits out of 40.
Yeah.
No, absolutely.
Do that math at scale. It's not pretty.
No, not at all.
How do you start to reconcile thinking around, now to use like just going to play framework, Tetris today, to use sort of like a second wave industrial era into like a knowledge age, to steal an Alvin Tofflerism? How do you take an organization that is, vertically integrated around compliance and
something you work in every day,
multi-year regulations and requirements and, horizons for them are like, yeah, we'll have this in like 10 or 15 years and that'll be all right. Yeah. How do you start to reconcile that with a need to bring in things that are maybe operating horizontally, that are bringing in maybe some intangible frameworks, new capability? How do you bring that sort of like future casting back into today? What does that look like from an organizational change standpoint? Because it's a behavior problem, right?
It is a behavior
It's not a
problem.
tech. Like the tech is all there for this.
Yep.
How do we start to change those behaviors? Or how have you seen that either really, really work or spectacularly fail?
Yeah, and I mean, you've talked about this with a bunch of other guests, right? There are amazing pockets within the DoD where we do things extremely successfully, and we see a lot of advancement and progress.
Yeah.
It's not all bad.
Yeah.
Right?
There's tons of good out there.
There's tons of good out there. It's just that the scale of the problems that we face, I think, sometimes overshadow that.
Yeah.
And it is difficult to mass produce technology innovation, right? Which I think is sort of your question. I think that there's a component of it where, it kind of goes back to the education and like, why do we trust somebody to do X but not Y? I think with technology, it's very akin to the phenomenon that we saw in the Vietnam War, where it was the first televised war, and the American populace, for the very first time, who thought warfare was a specific thing, all of a sudden was clued into the fact that it was not. The same phenomenon is happening now, in that the American public is extremely well educated on technology. And so they are part of the discourse, and they have more influence in the type of conversations and policies that we're driving.
Yeah.
And the same is true for service members, right? You have people coming into the service. We joke about it all the time, that the amount of technology and AI that you have on your phone before you show up to work is oftentimes far out.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I mean, come on. It
far exceeds what you've got
exceeds what you have in a skiff, right? So there is an element of that, of not necessarily cultural change, but just the basic fundamentals of how we operate as a society today. There is also an element of, it is difficult when you have a top-down organization trying to oversee all AI promulgation across the department, when we know that the model that actually works is often these extremely small, like find a way or make one people that back in the heyday, dude, like 2017, when none of us knew what we were doing, those were the glory days of you just figured it out. Yeah. You got to yes any way that you needed to. That becomes extremely constrained in the system that we've created today.
Yeah. It's interesting. So last two questions. One around, and I keep going back to the proxy because I find that to be like a useful vehicle for folks to understand. You know, we talk about the department, this large bureaucratic organization, attempting to sort of centralize control versus maybe decentralizing like operational control. Mm-hmm. Are there orgs out there? And I'm thinking everything from like your Toyotas back in the day to like how Microsoft does global delivery with like, last miles are done by GMs and stuff like that. Like, are there good examples that you see that folks can maybe take and have in the back of their head and be like, hey, these are the stories I can start to tell? Yeah. To maybe, to use like a Lewin change model, like start to prepare people for change before we drive a change. I think a lot of it is that sort of like front end education and communication to get folks maybe a little bit more accepting of like, okay, there should be a different way we do this. Yeah. And then you can start to really hammer in like, what is that way?
Well, so I think on what is that way, so many of those examples and those vignettes are areas where the new way of doing things overlaps with the old way of doing things. Yeah. And so you aren't actually shaking the tree that much. Yeah. And so I think that is one of the ways that you kind of
it's a slight pivot,
gain a little bit of momentum.
A Friends fan. Yeah.
Well, we do the same thing in futures, right? Where it is, what is the decision that we can make today that no matter the outcome will get us somewhere near where we want to be? Yeah. And so I think when you implement that type of thought process, it is far easier to
start making some progress.
Progress, for sure.
I like that. All right, last question, and dude, this could go anywhere because this is an awesome conversation.
Okay.
You've got a magic wand, right? Your Royal Highness.
Queen for a day.
100%.
Queen for a day.
What's the one thing you go change and why?
Yeah. I think we often couch this question. I've been listening to a bunch of episodes. Like so many of our friends have been on the on the podcast, right?
It's turning into the cool kids club. I feel so pretty.
Absolutely. Just like high school all over again. But no, I think that we tend to think about that question within like, how do we change the system? Yeah. And I think my response would be like, we don't change anything. I think when we start to ask the system to be something that it's not, it gets into this territory of being unable to seek out problems, not solve problems.
Interesting.
And so I think the piece that I would change is how we operate within it. How do we think more creatively given all of these constraints? How do we get to, yes, understanding that the system isn't going to change? Dude, I don't know how many people you've had on this podcast that have, talked about acquisition and talked about all of these massive problems that at some point maybe we do solve. But I think prevailing wisdom says that we don't.
Yeah.
And so how do you continue moving forward? That would be the thing that I change, our mindset around that.
Yeah, unshackle from the what's not possible, continue sort of infusing tier one talent into not sexy, but critically important roles.
Yeah. Well, and how
Harness
do you...
the magic of the people.
For sure. And then how do you advance that so that the pieces of the problem that are seemingly unsexy are the ones that we actually run after?
Yeah, heck
right?
Yeah.
Like how do
all
you
your condition setting for everything we're talking about. Yeah, it's a bunch of not sexy stuff.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, to our earlier point, it's like in this community, it's a certain archetype of people that are seeking out those problems. Yeah.
Dude, that rocks. This is so interesting, like personally and professionally. Like,
yeah, I appreciate it, man.
I think we don't do enough looking at like how we are thinking and like intellectually approaching and framing certain things. We rush towards like a tactical sort of outcome.
I know we're done.
So,
I know we're done, but
alibis are welcome. Yeah.
No, so I think to your point, right, so much of that in our ability to actually figure out what we need to build from a technical perspective has been hindered by exactly what you just mentioned, where we often have the technology. You've seen it both in the seat that you're in right now and also on the other side when you were in uniform of company X, product X, coming and showing and demoing, and then you have to figure out how that fits into your mission. And I think so much of that tied to my background, right, is even in places where we think we're doing that well and we promote user-centered design and UX and all of these things, when we are the user, you are still couching that within the parameters of we have the technology and you tell us how you use it. You already have it in mind. You've already built it in your head, rather than something that is more human, extrapolated out a level. And I think that piece of it, the whole system has been built around how do you take a technology that exists and make it work? And that is in the area, at JSOC, in SOCOM, broader umbrella, right? That's the places where we are most successful is when we don't do that.
Yeah.
It is the organic...
Like it's a stark reminder to folks to have that EQ sort of part of this where you sort of have that high empathy and understand sort of where your stakeholders are and what their reality is, and you're able to infuse where you are in your reality into that to sort of build it together. Instead of force feeding one into the other, because it just won't work. Dude,
absolutely.
I love it. Thanks again for swinging by.
Always.
This fucking rocked.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Cheers.